Hey RCC family, my name is Sam. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm so glad you found us here online and you can watch one of these messages here online. The goal of these messages is to help you represent Jesus well right where you're at, and we're so glad you can do that here. If you'd like to get connected with a church, whether us as a staff or in different ways, you can go down to the links below. You can do that through the links to get connected. You can also go on social media and find us on social media through those links. And then finally, if you want to continue to support the ministries of RCC, you can find a way to give there. We're so excited that you're a part of this church family and that you want to continue to grow your faith and grow in your ability to represent Jesus well right where you're at. Y'all awake still? Good morning. All right, good deal. Good to see you all. Glad you're all here this morning. It's a beautiful chance to, freeze our tails off as we walk into the building this morning. Glad you guys endured that way to go. Now we're nice and cozy in here. I'm so glad you're here this morning. We're starting a brand new series this week. We're calling it Shame on Who? Shame on who? We're talking about shame, which makes you feel really excited to be here, doesn't it? Maybe not, right? It's this weird thing that we talk about that makes us all of a sudden feel a little bit uncomfortable. But I want you to know that this is going to be, I think, one of the more encouraging series we've ever done, because I think when we understand the roots of shame, there's something really powerful that happens in us. And as we understand what God believes about it and does in us through it, it's going to be really helpful to us. And what I want you to know is that there's no other issue more core to who we are and how we experience the world than this thing called shame. And shame, as a result of sin, it's actually the very first thing that makes us apart from God. So God made us who we are, but who we are apart from God, the very first moment that we begin to change and shift, it happens as a result of shame. And what I want you to know as we go into this, it's really important, is that understanding shame and knowing how God deals with shame is critical to living the kind of life that God calls us to live. It's super critical for us to understand this well. And so as we get into this, we need to know that this text that we go to over and over again, this thing called the Bible is more than history, it's theology. It describes why and how we are who we are. The account of creation, especially the very beginning of the Bible, was carefully crafted to communicate who we are and why we are the way we are and what's true about our relationship with God. Can you imagine? Just for a moment, roll with me. Can you imagine waking up and as your eyes open, you feel so good, like you got the best night of sleep? Like, when was the last time you had that moment? And as you wake up, your eyes peel open and you look across the bed and you see with you this perfect partner. This perfect person that's with you in this life. And you get out of bed and there's this sense of strength in your bones, in your muscles. You feel strong, like maybe we've never experienced in this life. Like, you just feel so strong, you feel so confident. You go and you pick some fruit from the trees that are out your door and you enjoy it. It's delicious, it nourishes you. And not only that, but you set out immediately upon what is your purpose for the day. You know exactly who you are, why you're that way, and what you're supposed to do. You have a clear purpose for your life. You know all of these things, right? In fact, as you go about your day, there is not even the slightest hint of fear or worry. You can't even comprehend those emotions because, quite frankly, you've never experienced them. They've never been there. You've never felt fear or worry or any of those kinds of emotions. Can you imagine it? Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But this is it. This is the garden. This is humanity as designed. This is how we were supposed to feel. The Bible describes it this way. The Bible says, now the man and his wife were both naked, but they felt no shame. They felt no shame. That's how we were made to be. To feel no shame. But we know that this story, it has a ability to take a detour, right? We know the story takes a detour. In the garden with Adam and Eve are these other forces. There's one of these forces, this real being. It was the serpent, right? And just a quick note on this for a second. This serpent, we now would call it the devil. The term the devil was a translation from the term diablos, which was accuser in Greek. So literally at its core in the garden was the serpent, who is by definition the accuser. And so here he is in the garden, accuser's there, the serpent, who we know as the accuser. He is shrewd. And it says this, it says, one day he asked the woman, did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden? I think it's kind of funny. This is any of the trees, right? You can eat it from any of the trees. Of course, he's trying to twist the truth already. And so Eve responds. She says, "Oh, of course we can eat, just not the tree from the knowledge of the good, the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God said if we eat from that tree, we're going to die." And the serpent replies back very shrewdly, says, "You won't die. That's not what's going to happen if you eat from this wonderful tree. The fruit, look at that fruit. It looks amazing. You won't die. God just knows that if you eat from that fruit, your eyes will be open. You'll be able to be like God. You'll know the difference between good and evil. You will be like God." So God doesn't want you to eat from that because he doesn't want you to be like him. When Eve looks at the tree, looks at her husband who is with her, she's convinced. So she goes and she picks the fruit, takes a bite of it, gives the fruit to her husband, Adam, and he eats it. Notice he didn't put up a fight. He was right there in it with her. And in the moment, their eyes are opened. And suddenly they feel this shame. They're aware of their nakedness. And there it is, right from this beginning moment, shame. Shame comes as a result of us wanting to decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We want to decide for ourselves what's right and what's wrong apart from God. That's what sin has roots in. And shame produced this very first thing. It was the very first fashion show ever, right? Of fig leaves, right? Maybe that's a little bit, there's lettuce of some kind. That's what I thought that was. Anyways, you can keep going. But they hide their shame right under these fig leaves. And they were sitting there saying, I don't want you to see me because I'm embarrassed of who I am. I don't want you to see me completely. I think it's incredible how the Bible can pack so much into just a couple of sentences. Here's what happens next. It says, when the cool evening breezes were blowing, the man and his wife heard the Lord God walking about in the garden, so they hid from the Lord God among the trees. The natural reaction to shame is to hide, to cover, to conceal. It makes it so that we very literally hide from God. God asks in that moment, he says, hey, where are you guys? Which is a funny thing for God to ask because he obviously knows. But where are you? Like, what's going on here? Where are you guys? And Adam replies, I hid because I was naked. And then God says, who told you you were naked? In that moment, Adam says, well, God, it's this woman you gave me. She told me to eat the fruit. Which is blaming two different people at once, right? It's both the woman and God's fault because God gave him to, anyways. And then, after that, Eve says, oh, it was the serpent that tricked me. Like, immediately blame is there, right? Like, I'm going to deflect my blame and I'm going to put it on somebody else. I'm going to deflect my responsibility and I'm going to put it on someone else because I am ashamed of what I just did. I mean, we know this story as the beginning of sin, something we choose that causes self-inflicted separation from God. It's also the beginning of feeling shame, right? That first moment of choosing not God, choosing to decide for ourselves what's right and wrong, it makes us aware of our nakedness, and in our nakedness we hide, and in our shame we choose to just hide from other people and from God. It's a self-inflicted separation from God. God didn't do it to them, we did it to ourselves. And we've all experienced the effects of shame. I mean, if you've ever in your life turned red because of something someone said, has that ever happened to you? You blush, right? If you've ever changed your outfit a few times because nothing seems to quite look right. A few of you all the time, daily. If you've ever had someone turn you down for a date and it made you feel pretty small. If you've ever had something revealed about you that you just didn't want other people to know and suddenly it's out there and you just want to hide. If you've ever wanted to hide because of something you did, you've experienced shame. If you've ever said something that hurts someone else because you needed to redirect the attention because it was all on you and it made you feel uncomfortable, so you made fun of someone else so the attention would go over there. You felt shame before. If you've shied away from raising your hand because you feared not saying the right thing. If you have a child that has hid under the table mowing down chocolate because they know they're not supposed to be, you know what shame looks like. How many of you have experienced that or watched that happen? And when you catch them, they know, don't they? That was last week. It was me. No, I'm just kidding. If shame is anything, it's familiar to us, isn't it? But shame, it stems from our desire to be like God. The lie of the fruit found on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that we get to decide for ourselves what right and wrong are. That's the lie. The problem is you can't change what's right and what's wrong. But by deciding what we believe right and wrong are apart from God, by choosing it for ourselves, we are choosing this murky, volatile, utterly insecure kind of life. It's in a word, the result is shame. Because we don't know up from down and we just feel like we want to hide and kind of make our way through life in this swimming pool of murkiness. Because we don't know what right and wrong are because we've decided that we want to decide it for ourselves. And shame has a number of definitions. Here are a couple. This first one's a little bit longer, but I thought it was really helpful. It says shame is an emotion. It may or may not be related to something specific you do. It may come unexpectedly. It may be constant, relentless voice of shouting words of self-condemnation, or it may be a subtle whisper. It may be helpful. Shame can be helpful. We'll get to that. Or it may be destructive. As one of the most basic emotions that we experience, like anger or joy or sadness, shame is simply our internal reaction to things going on around or inside of us. The other definition that's much shorter is this. Shame is the sense that something is fundamentally wrong with me. We feel this. Shame is that fundamental feeling each of us have that we need to hide. That we don't measure up, that we've really messed it up. That if people were to see all of our hidden parts, all of the hidden things that we've done or didn't do, that we would experience them running so far away from us. This is shame. Shame can be categorized into three different forms, and these are the three forms of shame that we'll be talking about over the course of these next couple weeks. This week, and next week, and the week after that, we'll talk about three different forms of shame. The first one is natural shame. We'll be talking about that today. The second one is guilt or moral shame. So that'll be next week. And then the third one is imposed shame the following week. Guilt and moral shame. We'll talk about that one for a second first, to preview it. That's the one we normally think of when we think about shame. That's the normal thing. It's the reaction of someone who's sinned, who's done something that's wrong, that they feel this innate reaction to having done something wrong. We'll talk about how to identify it. We'll talk about the path to restoration when someone has done something morally wrong, either you yourself or someone else in your life. Then we'll also talk about the difference between forgiving someone and trusting someone, because forgiveness is not the same thing as trusting in the future. And that can be a really helpful thing as we're dealing with how to understand moral shame in the future or moral sin. And then we'll be talking about all of that and viewing that through the lens of what Jesus has done to erase and get rid of and cover guilt and shame in our lives. So that's next week. It's going to be super helpful. Whether you're dealing with something like, oh man, I don't know what to do with this, I can feel the weight of it, or you have an experience with someone else in your life that you don't know how to interact with them with this thing that's happened. It can be really, really helpful. So I hope you'll be here for that next week. The week after that, we're going to talk about imposed shame. Imposed shame. Most of us live with this form of shame day in and day out. It's constant, and it can be highly damaging. This is the shame we're talking about when we say something like, they were guilt tripping me. Have you ever felt guilt tripped? You can raise your hand. Yes, you can raise your hand and share. So some of you have, but none of you have. Okay, I feel like this is a normal thing in life where you are being guilt tripped. Like, oh, I really wish you would have done this. Can you hear that voice? Have you heard that before? Like some kind of thing where you're being imposed a level of shame that is not about a moral decision, but is something that now suddenly makes you feel like you have to do something. That is a way of moral shame. We'll talk about how to define this kind of shame for ourselves, how to understand when it's being done to us, and when we're doing it to ourselves or to other people. We'll also see how to understand the truth in those moments so we don't have to be defined by imposed shame. So if you've ever in your life felt this persistent low-grade shame that doesn't fade no matter how often you confess it or ask Jesus for relief, that message will be directly for you, and I think it'll be very, very helpful. But today, we need to talk about animal skins. Yes. Today, we need to talk about animal skins. At the end of the garden account, there is this single line that is just saturated with meaning. It says this. It says, then the man, Adam, named his wife Eve because she would be the mother of all who live. And the Lord God made clothing from animal skins for Adam and his wife. They'd just been kicked out of the garden. They've just been kicked out of the garden, and God cares so very much about them that he does not want them to walk around with these insignificant fig leaves on them that don't really cover their shame. So, think about that. This is the very first sacrifice made in order to cover the shame of humans. And God did it. The animals that Adam and Eve had named and quite likely loved and had a relationship with, like you maybe have had a relationship with an animal, like a dog or whatever it might be. Like in the garden, there was this perfect relationship between man and animal. They were naming the animals. So as you think about that, like grasp that, they lived in harmony with these animals, and now they're covering for shame. If you're paying attention, this is already a foreshadowing of what Jesus would one day accomplish on the cross. A sacrifice to pay for and cover our guilt and shame. But it's also an acknowledgement of a reality that we've had to live with since the first person had that bite of that fruit. The reality is this: we're limited. We're not capable of being enough. We are fallen humans. This is what we're going to call natural shame. This is the first level of shame that we experience in our life. It's what happens when you get to the end of the day and feel like you've just totally failed because you didn't knock off everything on your to-do list. It's what we feel when our body doesn't operate like we think it should. When we get sick, when we tell our bodies to do something, but they just won't do it, or you find yourself in bed and you just can't bring yourself to get out because you're so exhausted, or your body's not doing what you want it to. It's the inability or struggle to have kids of your own. It's when you just can't learn something. The concept, it just won't settle in. Like the other people can learn it, but I just can't. I give up. I'm so struggling. I'm so frustrated. I'm so ashamed of my inability to do something. This is the definition. It says natural shame is that humble acceptance of our constitutional limitations as human beings. It is accepting reality. It is that sense that people have that they are incomplete creatures that live in an incomplete world. It is what Christians mean by fallenness and what they accept as a biblical view of life. We do fall short. We are fallible, frail, and limited. It was not our created nature, but it is what our human nature has become. This is normal for us. This is the way we live. I mean, I remember being a young kid and looking in the mirror upset because I didn't feel like I was fit enough, and I was like 10. And this is just a real thing that we experience from a young age. I remember being frustrated with myself because I didn't get as good a grade as the other kids did. Man, I was trying hard, but I'd write a paper in college and other people would get a better grade than me. And it didn't make sense. I mean, I have a million stories of how I've fallen short of being the husband I wish I was, of being the father I wish I was. And I'm not talking about these outright sins or these egregious actions. I'm just talking about the fact that I'm limited. You're limited. We're limited. We are nowhere near perfect. We just can't be. So over the next 2 weeks, we'll talk about how to resolve shame. With moral shame, we'll talk about going to Jesus and experiencing restoration. With imposed shame, we'll talk about understanding what's true and setting appropriate boundaries. The reality is, though, that stuffed and ignored shame has power over us. The only way for shame to lose its power is to resolve it. Reminded of that book. Somebody talked about this week. You can't go around it. You can't go over it. You have to go. There you go. You're with me. You're awake. Great job. I'm so glad. This natural shame that we feel, our limited, finite humanness, the only way to resolve our natural shame is to accept it. To accept it. It's what Paul writes. When he writes in Romans 12, he says these words. He says, because of the privilege and authority God has given me, I give each of you this warning. Don't think you are better than you really are. Be honest in your evaluation of yourselves, measuring yourselves by the faith God has given us. I joke that that's my favorite verse because I can tell people, don't think you're better than you really are. But what it really should be is, Sam, don't think you're better than you really are. And that's a gift. And that's a massive gift. Because it means you don't have to be everything to everyone all the time. There's something powerful about acknowledging our limitedness, acknowledging our need for other people. The next verses in Romans 12 talk about how we're part of the body of Christ, meaning we're part of this church, right? Part of a group of people that are trying to follow Jesus, and each person gets to play a particular role. You are limited because we need each other. It's a gift. In fact, acknowledging our natural shame, this limited nature that we have, our natural state of limitedness, frailness, fallenness, it's key to dealing with the other kinds of shame we'll talk about over the next 2 weeks. Because if you can't admit that you're naturally not perfect, these other pieces will be very difficult to resolve. And resolving shame, it really, really matters. To the extent that if we don't, it will cause us to live a life that is really burdened and really hidden and really isolated. The goal of shame, literally, like the end result of shame is for us to hide. It's to go off into a corner somewhere and be away from everyone. C.S. Lewis, he describes there's a book he wrote, there's a Pondering of Hell. Yay. He talked about it and imagined what hell would be like and if he were to understand it the best he could. And he says at the end of it, hey, I'm not sure if this is exactly right, but what he describes is this world in which each person thinks they're living in heaven, but it's actually a hell because they go as far from other people as they possibly can. They recede into a place of living where they become a shadow of themselves. They're literally weightless, empty, and they live as far from other people as possible, thousands of miles from the next person. And hell is literally the ability for them to get as far from others as possible. So we don't have to interact with other people. Don't have to have people see us. Don't have to have people know us, because that's frightening. That's what shame does. It makes us recede. Makes us feel embarrassed. It breaks connection. Shame, when it rules, isolates us. Our purpose as humans is relational. It's to connect with God, to connect with others, and to know ourselves through God's eyes. That's our purpose as humans. When we let shame rule in our lives, it leads us to a hell of our own making. Isolation, self-pity, resentment, all the ugly stuff. So if we try to ignore this natural fallen state we live in, we'll slowly move ourselves toward a more and more isolated life. So then the question is, okay, what do we do? I mean, if we are naturally experiencing this limitedness and we don't want to live this isolated life where we find ourselves trouncing off to some other place where we don't have to acknowledge or be with other people, how do we get out of this? Like, how do we make sure that we don't find ourselves in this place where we don't feel connected to other people or to God? Because it's a really scary place to live. And maybe you're sitting here right now this morning like, that's me. I don't want anybody else to know me. I am ashamed that I can't measure up in any area. I have these physical things that I can't do. I have these mental things that I'm just not as good as other people at, and I am ashamed of those things. I just want to hide. But I know that hiding will lead me toward this ugly place. And I've experienced it, and I feel alone. I feel isolated. Shame is killing me. What do you do? There's a few things that can be first steps towards connecting back with God and others. And the first step is this: the key to resolving natural shame is acceptance. It's acknowledging your limited nature. It's the simple act of saying, hey, God, I don't know if you know this or not. I know you're God, so you probably do, but I haven't ever said it to you. Hey, God, this is something that I do. I'm just limited. Like, I just am unable to be who I once was. I can't keep up like I used to. Silly example, like I really want to be a good runner still. I can't keep up with the young kids anymore, and I'm really frustrated about it, okay? I'm acknowledging that with you. I'm mad about it. It's not going to change. So God, I'm sorry. I'm not even sorry. I'm just, here it is. This is it. Number 2, confess regularly. Say it out loud, especially to God and then to a trusted friend. And it's not fancy. You say, hey, I don't know if you know this, but I'm not good at that. I'm not good at that. Or I want to get all of that done, but I wasn't able to. I had that list. I didn't get it done. I'm acknowledging my limitedness. I did not get that list done. I tried, but I didn't. Or, you know what? I allowed my phone to suck me in for the 3,000th time, and I just was scrolling, okay? I'm acknowledging that I did that. I tried to not, but my self-discipline failed, and I messed it up. I'm acknowledging my shortcomings. Number 3, give the gift of going first. Do you know what's really hard? Admitting you're not perfect. Do you know what's really helpful? When someone says they're not perfect first. The gift of going first is just an incredible gift because it does 2 things. 1, it's an opportunity for connection. We are designed, our purpose is to connect with each other and with God. And so by saying, hey, I fall short in this way to another person, you've now given them permission to connect with you by saying, hey, I'm so glad you told me that because, me too. I'm the same. I feel the same way. And you know what just happened in that moment? You're closer to each other. You're less isolated. Shame no longer rules in that situation. Number 4. Lean on the grace of Jesus. We're going to touch on this more next week especially, but ultimately, Jesus came to pay the price we couldn't pay. Resolve the shame we couldn't resolve. And he makes us perfect in God's eyes because we couldn't do that on our own, could we? We couldn't do that on our own. So, this then leads to the final piece. It's to purposely move toward others. And by others, I also include God in that. Toward God and others, you can add. Instead of moving away from people and isolating, we're going to choose to move closer to God and others. The natural result of shame is isolation. You can fight this by purposely being honest and close to other people instead of hiding. I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you've ever had something in your life that you have felt so embarrassed by, or something that you felt like, oh, I can't believe I did that, or I can't believe I fell short in that way, and all of a sudden you admitted it to somebody, there's this reality that happens always, and it's actually all throughout Scripture, where this weight that felt like it was on your shoulders drops. It feels like you lost 100 pounds. It's incredible. Don't miss that opportunity. Don't let that weight control your life. There's even studies out there where the body literally reacts to shame and makes you more and more sick in different ways, or more susceptible to sickness because of what's happening, right? And if you let that go, your body literally is free, physically too. Don't let it rule you. Now, here's an important note about this. This act, all 5 of those things that we just mentioned, they can feel like dying. I'm not sugarcoating it, sorry. They can feel like dying. Admitting you're not perfect, admitting your faults, it can be so excruciating, but it's actually the only way to live, like to really live. The only way to not grow more isolated, more cold, more bitter, more resentful, As I was working on this message, I heard this song by a band called Judah and the Lion, and the lyric from this song caught my attention. It's 6 feet deep where you gotta go to come alive to this beautiful life. 6 feet deep, and if you don't know that reference, that's how deep they bury you. 6 feet under, the lyric is saying, you have to die before you can live. Not literally, but to yourself. It's just echoing Jesus' own words. Jesus said this. He said, then Jesus said to his disciples, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? These are the words of the man who gave his actual life to fulfill the purpose of those first animal skins, except far more completely. To remove our sin, to remove our guilt, to remove our shame, to help us rest in him when we're made aware of our own limited human nature, knowing I don't have to be enough because he is. To place our trust in him first and foremost. This life is worth living. It's beautiful. But you have to get through that dying to yourself part first. That part that makes you feel like you have to hold on to everything and hide everything so that nobody thinks you're anything less than perfect. You have to let go of that part first. So today, resolve this natural shame. Don't let it rule you. Do so by accepting it, right? To start that process of dying to yourself, acknowledge your own limited nature. Confess regularly to God and each other. Give the gift of going first. And as you do this, lean on the grace of Jesus. Know that he makes you right. He makes you perfect. And then as you're doing this, move toward others, not away. Shame wins when we grow more isolated. God wins, and we win. We experience the most beautiful kind of life when we move toward each other and toward God, when we're less isolated. So much more to come in these next 2 weeks. There's so much more in the talk of moral and guilt shame, and then the imposed shame. They're really helpful to us as we understand them. So please don't miss these next couple weeks. If you miss in person, catch it online. I really think that these things can be so helpful in us navigating a world that is quite literally chock full of shame-induced stuff. And if you want to live the life that God has for you, it starts with resolving those things so that we can live closer to each other and enjoy relationship and community far, far more with God and with each other. So that's going to be my prayer, that we would not let shame win in that way, and that we would resolve to resolve this sin or resolve this shame in our life and draw closer to each other because of it. Would you pray with me? Dear God, thank you. Thank you that in the first moment of us experiencing shame as humans in this world, you covered us. That you did not want us walking around in shame. So as we live this life, God, it's so easy to find ourselves realizing our limitedness, and it's so easy to try and hide it. God, help us to not hide it. Help us to acknowledge it with you and with each other, with trusted people in our life. And then let that set us free. Free to enjoy each other's company. Free to enjoy knowing you more fully and also seeing ourselves through your eyes, not other people's. And then help us, God, to embrace this gift of being set free of guilt and shame that your Son gives us. We ask that you would be healing here with this group of people because we